Acmen septimius suos amores tenens in gremio me inquit acme, ne te perdita matqua mare porro omnes assidue paratus annos, quantum qui pote plurimum perire, solus in libi indi aquae tosta caesio veni obuius leoni. Ocut dixit amor sinistru tante dextra sternuita probationem. Atac me leviter caput reflectens et dulcis puerebrios ocellos illo purpure suaviata, sic inquit mea vita septimille, vicuni dominusque serviamus, ut multo mihi maior acriorque ignis mollibus ardet in medullis. Ocut dixit amor sinistru tante dextra sternuita probationem. Nunc ab auspicio bono profecti mutuis animis amantamantur, unam septimius misellus acmen ma vult quam Sirias Britanniasque, un in septimio fidelis acme facet delicias libidinesque, qui sullos homines beate ore vidit quis veneraus peccati orem. Septimius, holding Acme, the object of his desire in his lap, says, My Acme, if I do not love you recklessly, and I am not ready to love you hereafter for all the years continuously, as much as anyone who is most able to die from love, may I alone come face to face with the grey-eyed lion in Libya and sun-baked India. As he said this, Love, as before on his left, now on his right, sneezed his approval. And Acme, bending her head back lightly, and having kissed the drunken eyes of the sweet boy with the purple mouth, says, Thus, little Septimius, my life, may we serve this one love continuously, as a sharper and greater fire burns more for me in my soft marrows. As she said this, Love, as before on his right, now to his left, sneezes his approval. Now they, having leapt from the good sign, are loved by mutual spirits. Poor little Septimius prefers Acme alone to all the Syrians and Britons. Faithful Acme makes pleasure and love-making only with Septimius. Who sees any happier people? Who sees fortunate Venus? Do nec gratus eram tibi, nec quisquam potior brachia candidae cervici juvenista per saurum vigui rege beatior. Do nec non alia magisar sisti nequerat Lydia post Chloen, multi Lydia nominis Romana vigui clari Aurelia. Me nunc thressa Chloe rege dulcis docta modos, et Cytherae siens, pro qua non metuam mori si parcent animae fata superstiti. Me torret facemur tua Thurini calais, filius orniti pro quo bis patiar mori, si parcent puero fata superstiti. Quid si prisca redit venus ductosque jugo, cogita eneo, si flauex cutitor Chloe, reiectaeque patet, Janua Lydiae, quamquam sidere pulcriori lestu levior, corticatin probo iracundior hadria te cum vivera men, te coveam libens. As long as I was pleasing for you, and no other more able young man was giving his arms to your white neck, I thrived more happily than the king of Persia. As long as you did not burn more for another woman, and Lydia was not after Chloe, Lydia of great name, I thrived more famously than the Roman Rhea Silva. Now Thracian Chloe rules me, learned in sweet poetry and knowing of the lyre, for whom I will not fear to die, if the fates will spare the surviving spirit. Calais, The son of Thernian Ornytus burns me with a mutual torch, for whom I would suffer to die twice, if the fates will spare the surviving boy. What if ancient Venus returns and drives the separated ones underneath the bronze yoke? If golden Chloe is driven out, and the door lies open for rejected Lydia? Although that man is more beautiful than a star, you are more fickle than cork, and angrier than the unprincipled Hadriatic Sea. I would love to live with you. I, willing, would die with you. The reason I chose Catullus 45 and Horace 3.9 for analysis is because they're very similar in the topic which they discuss. In both poems, they describe interactions between two lovers. In Catullus 45, it's a third-person view. In Horace 3.9, it's a first-person view, and actually a conversation between two former lovers. In addition, I chose these poems because I wanted to contrast the attitudes of both from a modern perspective and from a historical perspective. Sorry about the laughter downstairs. My parents are having a party. Anyway, so I really hope that you enjoy this analysis of these two. Like I said, I'm mostly going to be covering the attitudes of the two lovers, both from a historical perspective and from a modern perspective, as well as kind of comparing the structures of the poem and comparing and contrasting those as they kind of line up with each other. Looking a little more in depth at Catullus 45 from a modern perspective first, it seems like the poem has a very sarcastic and bitter attitude towards it. Just looking at some of the vocabulary that Catullus chooses, his use of diminutives, more specifically septimilae, basically saying little Septimius, one gets a sense, you can just imagine the voice with which Catullus is telling this poem. Kind of like going, oh, it's so cute, it's a little guy in love. Something like that. Very condescending. And from that condescending perspective, we can infer that Catullus currently has a very bitter idea towards the concept of these two lovers publicly displaying their affection for one another. Another indication of Catullus's sarcastic attitude also stems from the repeated phrase "Hoc ut dixit amor sinistrutante dextra sternuita probationem," or loosely translated as he said this, love, as before on his right, now to his left, sneezed his approval. When we hear the word sneeze from a modern perspective, we get the sense, like Catullus, that amore is mocking their love. Like their love isn't even worth words, only a bodily sound that is rather embarrassing. So with the repetition of this phrase, we get a satiric feeling to the poem from Catullus. However, another perspective actually suggests that sneezing was viewed as a good omen by the Romans, which is where the historical perspective kind of comes into context here. G.P. Gould suggests this idea, and if his suggestion is indeed accurate, then the poem completely alters the attitude with which Catullus talks about the two lovers. Rather than being a bitter, kind of resigned old man telling about how these two lovers are publicly kissing one another, it becomes a celebration of two lovers and a celebration of their youth and their vitality and the passion with which they hold for one another. And instead of becoming satiric, it becomes genuine. And we, as a result, we as readers enjoy the character of Catullus more. And we don't think to ourselves, well, aren't you, Mr. Fancy Pants, just shunning these two lovers like this? From a modern perspective, the differences in attitude in between Horus 3.9 and Catullus 45 are in stark contrast. In Horus 3.9, the poem has a genuine sense of being authentic, while in Catullus 45, the entire thing feels satiric and bitter, and we honestly don't like Catullus very much at the end of it. But at Horus 3.9, honestly, I got a feeling of feeling pretty bad for Horus. He's talking with a former lover of his that has since moved on to dating other people, as has he. But at the end of the poem, they talk about how nice it would be to be back together if they were given the opportunity. If they could abandon their current lovers, if it were really that easy, then they would easily go back into each other's arms. But they really can't. And this is somewhat confirmed by Horace's two lines, Quid si prisca redit venesti ductosque jugo cogitaeneo, which loosely translated says, what if ancient Venus returns and drives together the separated, you assume lovers, under a bronze yoke, which really suggests that it would take an extreme measure to bring these two back together, and kind of implies that the relationship doesn't really have much hope, despite the obvious feelings that these two still have for each other. Kind of as a wrap-up of sorts, Catullus 45 and Horus 3.9 differ in their attitudes really depending on the perspective with which we as readers view the poems. From a modern lens, Horus 3.9 is seen as kind of a tragic poem because it's about two lovers that cannot get back together despite the mutual feelings that they have for each other. Catullus 45, in stark contrast, suggests a bitter or sarcastic attitude towards two lovers that are publicly displaying their affections for one another. We don't really like Catullus very much from a modern lens at the end of Catullus 45, and we kind of feel bad for Horus at the end of Horus 3.9. From a historical standpoint, surprisingly, these poems are fairly similar in the attitudes, except Catullus 45 turns into less of a satire and more of a benediction on Catullus's part, and a congratulatory poem praising the two lovers for their actions with each other and the passions that they have for one another. Horus 3.9, I think from that perspective, you still get a sense of sadness and longing from the two lovers, but they really can't do anything about it. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast. I know I go off on some tangents sometimes, but I think I did a pretty good job analyzing these poems, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, evening, or middle of the night, whatever it may be. Have a good night.